Before continuing with this video, make sure you've watched the IIS configuration video just so you understand the things that need to be configured inside of IIS as well as for certificates for your ticketing API solution to work. Let's move on to the session API. The session module API allows Qlik Sense sessions to be bound by an external system. And this is a great option for software as a service offerings or extranets or anywhere where you have a host application that is already generating a cookie and you want to control your Qlik Sense session by that same cookie that's controlling your host application. So the flow goes something like this. The user accesses the identity provider, which, for example, can be integrated into a portal. The identity provider authenticates the user, and after that, the identity provider creates a new session. So in this case, what's happening is we're logging into the identity provider. We're logging into our portal or our host application, and at that point, a cookie is being created that represents our session. That's being passed back to the browser, and that's being set on the browser on the client side. We then go ahead and we are also sending that information to Qlik Sense through the Proxy service API using the session endpoint where we're sending that same session information. So when we log into Qlik Sense through the proxy, Qlik Proxy service is going to see that we already have a cookie set for our Qlik Sense session. It's going to check the session module to see if there is actually a representative value that matches the value that's in our cookie. And if so, it's going to go ahead and authenticate us to Qlik Sense content. So it's like I said, it's a great way to bind Qlik Sense to your portal, to your host application. All right, jumping into the sample code of the session request ASPX file, you can see we start off by adding a namespace for system.web.sessionState. So that's going to help us get our session kicked off inside of .NET that will pass to Qlik Sense to go ahead and create our Qlik Sense session. So I start off and I've got some formatted HTML here. That's using Bootstrap. The really important stuff is in the script. And we start off with the session request method. So the session request method is basically the method that's going to go ahead and connect to Qlik Sense and provide session information to the Qlik Sense server and enable us to authenticate. So when we look at session request, we start off by adding a certificate. And the certificate, like you may have heard in some other webinars that you may have seen, is required for the Qlik Proxy service. In order to make a connection, you need to use HTTPS. In this case, we're using the supplied Qlik client certificate that comes as part of the Qlik install. Doing that requires the service point manager certificate validation callback to basically ignore any sort of issues with the certificate, and the purpose of that is it comes from a self-sign root, and in .NET is not set up to accept self-signed roots, so this service point manager call is required in order for us to pass the certificate but not run into any issues. We make our call to the session endpoint of our virtual proxy for the proxy service in order to connect to the session. And then we create our request. We add our cross-site scripting keys. We're making a post request. And the body of our message is taking the user ID and the user directory that we're passing into Qlik Sense along with the session ID, which we'll show that code in a moment, and sending that to Qlik Sense. Once that's done, we get a response that will basically tell us whether or not the session for this user is, if the user is newly activating a session in Qlik Sense or if they're coming in through a different session ID. The next method is this go button session. The first thing that we'll do when we start the page is actually get a session. And we're doing this through the session ID manager that's part of the web session state .NET library. So we'll go in, we'll create our new session ID, and we'll just print that out to a text value. Then we have our Qlik method, which will go ahead, take the session request. It's going to give us our response, and in that response, we're going to pull out the session value that we created earlier. And then we're going to go ahead and create a cookie. And this is a big distinction. If you've watched the ticketing webinar, big distinction between the session module and the ticketing module is with the ticketing module that the session cookie that gets created for Qlik Sense is actually created by the Qlik Sense server. In the case of the session API module, it's the code that we're creating or our host application or our portal that actually already contains the session cookie. So in my sample, we're creating the session cookie, but it's possible that it already exists. So we're taking that session cookie and we're making sure that we supply our session cookie header name to this cookie, and then we're passing in our session ID, and then we're also setting this cookie up with a domain. And the reason why we're doing that is we want our cookie to basically stay in our browser as we shift from using our web server or our host application and we move into the Qlik Sense world. We're adding that to the request and the response. We're adding the cookie, and then we're just outputting it to a text value. Lastly, we've got our launch button click, and our launch button click just redirects to the hub because we already have our cookie set. We have our ID on the Qlik Sense server. When the two of them connect as part of the authentication process, everything will work and we'll be able to get into Qlik Sense. Before we test our code, let's go ahead and take a look at the virtual proxy configuration. So I'm going to go into the QMC and go to virtual proxies, and you'll see I have this session VP virtual proxy set up, and let's go ahead and take a look at how it's configured. So up top in my description, I've got session VP. That's my description for it. The prefix is the same, and then you can see my session cookie header name here is also the same as the prefix. I like to do that just for best practice purposes. It keeps everything streamlined. I'll go ahead and I'll click on the authentication tab, and you'll see it does say I'm set up for ticket, but I'm actually using the session API. The way that I'm doing that is I'm sending my authentication module redirect URI to my QSession code that we just looked at. My load balancing is set up to my central node. I have my whitelist set up to both my Qlik Sense server as well as my web server, just to make sure that these servers are able to access the Qlik proxy service through this virtual proxy. And I don't have anything set up for a session module base URI or a load balancing module base URI, but you may want to investigate using those as well for the purposes of creating sessions within your host applications. I've linked it to my central proxy, and now I'm able to go ahead and test my code. Okay, let's fire up a new browser. So I'm going to close this, open this up, and I'm going to go to my web server and to my session code. I'm going to start off by clicking Create Session Variable, and that's going to give me my session. And then I'm going to type in my server, my virtual proxy, my sense user directory, as well as my user ID. I'm going to create a session. That gives me my user directory, my user ID as well as my session ID. You can see they match, and then you can also see my cookie with the domain set. And when I go to Qlik Sense, voila, I'm into the hub. And that's because I've got that session already banked in the Qlik Sense environment, and I've already created the cookie in advance, and I'm just matching those two together to complete the authentication. To download this sample and more, go to Qlik Branch. Qlik Branch is our open, collaborative, open source environment for developers, where there are developers sharing different types of Qlik Sense and QlikView integrations every day. If you go to Browse Projects, you can see a list of the available solutions that are available to download. And if you go into Security Integration and the QS Session ASP.NET page, that will be the session information or the example that we used in the video today.